Sons and world domination. The world belongs to whoever gives birth to most men, thus to whoever gives birth to most children. When you study history and the different fates of peoples over a longer period of time, one finds that many of the really important factors are such which the history's actors are quite unaware of. Marxism, for an example, talk about their production factors and production conditions, and of course there is a value in the materialist historical approach. But a factor which is usually unmentioned is the demographic one. This because a demographic perspective almost automatically lead to politically incorrect conclusions. If you look at history and society from the demographist eyes, one have to wonder what the fast mass immigration of foreign peoples to America and Europe, where the Americans and the Europeans give birth to very few children, well below the replacement level, eventually will lead to in the long run. The demographic perspective leads us quickly to a realism that is not compatible with a politically correct world. An interesting and valuable introduction to a demographic materialism is given by the German sociologist Gunnar Heinsohn. Heinsohn is the author of the politically incorrect book Söhne und Weltmacht, Terror im Aufstieg und Fall der Nationen, published in 2003, and the eminent German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk is described as equally innovative as Marx's Kapital. The book has not received any attention in the media, and in regards to the emerging question why, I'm going to let you figure that one out yourselves. It is recommended for any traditionalist, identitist, or nationalist to read, but also Marxists should find Heinsohn's perspective to be of value, since Heinsohn's approach complements Marx's rather rudimentary theories about the material base. If any of you are Danish or familiar with the Danish language, perhaps speak a language related to the Danish language, then there's an interesting interview in PDF format, which I will link to here below in the information box. The interview is labeled The Loser's Continent. It might be well worthy to look that one up. Youth's bulges. Heinsohn are opposed to the usual explanation for wars, claims which suggest that it is due to poverty, exploitation, and the like. Instead, he introduces the concept of demographic youth bulge as an explanation. A people get a youth bulge when the younger men's share of the population gets too large. Heinsohn's definition is that 30% of males should be between 15 and 29 years old. These young men will see their opportunities for positions in society are limited, which makes them aggressive and dissatisfied. This may lead to civil war, revolution, genocide, wars of conquest, and more. He mentions that both the early fascism, National Socialism, and Bolshevism was dominated by young men, and were associated with huge youth bulges. This is in accordance with what the Russian National Bolshevist Leninov said, that you can see these movements and most of the revolutions as a war between the generations. This is not because they are poor in absolute terms, but in relative terms. That is to say, they are not starving, but threatened to become losers or degraded to a substandard. The amount of power and respect is limited, even in a society where everyone has food on the table. On the contrary, a population that is starving is not particularly active politically. Heinsohn points out that Europe today is surrounded by a Muslim world with a giant youth bulge. From 1900 to the year of 2000, the Muslim world has grown from 150 million to 1,200 million in just 100 years. There is a large number of young men who may become a threat, both to each other and against their neighbors in those countries. Heinsohn means that it is madness to give assistance to countries with a rapid population growth, since it just leads to youth bulges growing even more at a faster rate, with more violence as a result thereafter. Nor does he believe that a country with so few young men as the United States in the long run should occupy a youth bulk countries such as Iraq. Religions for angry youths. At a time when much focus is put on what a violent religion Islam is, Heinsohn adds in an interesting argument. At a time when much focus is put on what a violent religion Islam is, Heinsohn adds in an interesting argument. He argues that the angry young men themselves are creating ideologies and religions if they need it, to legitimize any revolutions and war of aggression. The Spanish conquistadors he sees therefore not as Christians, but as Christianists, just as militant Muslims today are described as Islamists. From his own experience of 1968, he points out that the young revolutionaries then, in no time, created the revolutionary ideologies that they needed to legitimize their psychological need for revolution. They thus create the enemies they need. They need scapegoats, and who better to blame it all on, but on these individuals who are responsible for everything. This is reminiscent of Don Quixote seeing dragons in the windmills. An ethnic underclass. Heinsohn also addresses the ethnic and demographic situation in Europe. He describes how the Europeans are undergoing a demographic capitulation, which means that we get fewer and fewer young ones. While we have a welfare system that encourages many immigrant families to have very many children, this means that there is a career option for women, where they take low-paid jobs on a part-time while they breed very many children. But for the young men, the same career opportunities are non-existing, and they often lack the intellectual skills necessary to advance socially. These young men do not often not become criminals, and are also potential recruits for the movement that seeks to take over the new host countries. There are still individuals within the left who fantasize that this non-European youth bulge will be headed by a European left in some sort of a class camp, class war, and introduce a classless society, but the most likely scenario is that they will introduce some kind of ethnic hierarchy with more or less religiously totalitarian elements. The leftists will not get their grey and bland feminism, vegetarianism, atheism, multicultural, diverse, or classless society. It will be the opposite. This brings to my attention the Orwellian hierarchy analysis, which I will introduce you to in a possible coming article. The Heinsohn interview is very interesting, and he addresses such phenomena as white flight between the continents, how the young Europeans are moving to other countries. However, much of his proposed solutions are not realistic, and reveals that he, after all, lacks an ethnic consciousness. He suggests, for an example, that Europe should attract a couple of millions of young Chinese, and that we should abolish the welfare state because it is impossible to imagine a ethnically aware resurrection for Heinsohn. So, the way Heinsohn sees it, a ethnically aware resurrection is not going to see daylight. It is similar to the argument, in order to save the village, we have to burn it down. It makes absolutely no sense, as it is an oxymoron and inconsistent. itself implodes. Unless if he is aware of sociobiology and racial differences, and thus prioritize the Chinese over Arabs and Africans for pragmatic reasons. He would still not make any sense, as it still is an oxymoron and is inconsistent with saving and maintaining Europe. You have just changed the imperialist and thus continue to destroy it, which is what we, as well as he, want to prevent. These are shortcomings one have to be aware of when reading the interview. Heinsohn is something of a defeatist, and therefore believe that it is impossible for there to exist an ethnic awakening, despite the fact that we today now see clear signs that this has begun. Nationalist parties all over Europe, all being the fastest growing parties, for an example. And when such phenomenon takes place, such things as repatriation, deliberately encouraging childbirths, and the like, is at least as realistic as the mass importation of Chinese people.